Jack thought he had endured the worst life could throw at him. Grueling nights as a paramedic, a distant father, and a marriage strained by absence. But nothing could prepare him for the day he came home early to find his wife and his father together, shattering his world in one unforgivable moment.
The wail of a siren pierced the crisp evening air as Jack gripped the steering wheel of the ambulance, his knuckles white with tension. The heartbeat monitor beeped frantically in the background, a relentless reminder that someone's life hung by a thread. Jack's voice cut through the chaos, steady yet urgent. "Hang on! We're almost there!" he called over his shoulder to the injured man in the back, while his partner scrambled to stabilize the patient. This was Jack's life, an endless sprint against death, where seconds stretched into an eternity, and every decision carried the weight of consequence. But tonight, as the adrenaline subsided, a familiar shadow crept into his mind. Memories of his father, George. Jack had been only 10 when his mother passed away suddenly, leaving George, a towering figure of grit and discipline, to raise him alone. The void left by her death was palpable, but George filled it not with warmth, but with a rigid, unyielding hand. "Men don't cry, Jack," George barked one evening, his voice rough like the sandpaper he used in his carpentry shop. Jack, tears streaming down his face, clutched a skinned knee from a fall during recess. Instead of comfort, he was met with a damp cloth thrust into his hands. "Clean yourself up. Be a man, or you'll disappoint me." Jack quickly learned that showing vulnerability was a weakness George wouldn't tolerate. Small mistakes, spilling milk at the breakfast table or forgetting to take out the trash, invited sharp words and sometimes harsher consequences. Once, at age 12, Jack accidentally dropped a plate while clearing the dinner table. It shattered on the tiled kitchen floor, its sound echoing in the silence. "Do you think plates grow on trees?" George demanded, his face a storm cloud of rage. Before Jack could stammer an apology, George's hand connected with his cheek. The slap wasn't just a sting on his skin, it was an indelible mark on his psyche, one that whispered to him even years later, "You're not enough." The next day, Jack stayed late at school, helping his teacher organize bookshelves just to avoid going home. The teacher, Mrs. Henson, noticed the redness on his face. "Jack, are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Jack nodded quickly, avoiding her gaze. He didn't want pity. He just wanted to feel normal. George wasn't always a tyrant. On rare occasions, there were glimpses of the man Jack wanted to love. On one frigid winter morning, George showed Jack how to start a fire in the wood stove. His hands, calloused but steady, guided Jack's smaller ones. "You have to be patient," he said, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "Rush it, and it'll never catch." For a fleeting moment, Jack felt a connection, a spark of warmth in the cold structure of their relationship. But those moments were rare, like drops of water in a parched desert. More often, George was a man consumed by his own disappointments and anger. The loss of Jack's mother seemed to hollow him out, leaving a shell hardened by survival. He worked 2 grueling jobs, a carpenter by day, a janitor by night, just to keep food on the table. And while Jack admired his father's resilience, the cost of that survival was steep. By the time Jack reached high school, he had learned to navigate his father's moods, tiptoeing around landmines of irritation. But the damage was done. Jack's need for approval became an insatiable drive to succeed, to prove that he was worth something, even if George never said it aloud. "Hey, Dad, I made the honor roll," Jack once said, holding the certificate out like a peace offering. George glanced at it briefly, grunted, and returned to his newspaper. "That's what you're supposed to do. No need for a parade." Now, decades later, as Jack parked the ambulance and handed off the patient to the ER team, those memories felt as raw as ever. The lines between past and present blurred. The life and death stakes of his job echoed the emotional intensity of his childhood. And though Jack had built a life defined by strength and resilience, the shadow of George's disapproval still loomed. The pager on Jack's hip buzzed, jolting him back to the present. Another call, another crisis. Jack climbed back into the ambulance, his face set in a mask of determination. The boy who once yearned for his father's approval had become a man who saved strangers' lives. But deep down, a question lingered. Could he ever save himself from George's ghost? Laura adjusted her pearl earrings in the mirror, tilting her head as she scrutinized her reflection. The warm, inviting smile she wore for her students had long since faded, replaced by a weary blankness. The small bedroom vanity, littered with scattered cosmetics and a cup of cold coffee, bore silent witness to her unraveling. Not tonight, she muttered to herself, brushing a hand through her blonde hair. He's probably exhausted anyway. The bedroom door creaked as she turned the handle, a reminder of how silent the house had become. When she first married Jack, silence had been rare. Their early days together were filled with laughter that bounced off the walls of their cozy starter home. Jack would chase her around the kitchen while she tried to cook, and their conversation stretched late into the night, spanning everything from shared dreams to silly inside jokes. Now, the silence pressed down on her like a weight. Jack was always working, rushing from one emergency to the next, his absence carving a void in their marriage. Laura told herself it wasn't his fault. His job saved lives, after all. But late at night, as she sat alone on the couch with only the faint hum of the TV for company, resentment began to creep in. "Hey, you're home," she said brightly one evening as Jack walked through the door, his uniform crumpled and his face lined with exhaustion. "Yeah," he replied, setting his bag down and heading straight for the fridge. "What's for dinner?" Laura bit her lip, the smile faltering. "I made lasagna. Your favorite." Jack grunted a vague acknowledgement, pulling out a soda and downing it in one go. He didn't even look up when Laura placed a plate in front of him. "How was work?" she ventured, her voice overly cheerful. Jack shrugged. "Same as always. Busy." She watched him eat in silence, the clinking of his fork against the plate, the only sound. A knot tightened in her chest, but she forced herself to keep talking. "I had a student write the most beautiful essay today," she began. "It was about—" "Laura, not now," Jack interrupted, rubbing his temples. "I'm beat. Can we just—" "Not—" Her hands clenched under the table. "Sure," she whispered, her appetite evaporating. That was how it had been for months. Each small rejection, each brush-off, added another brick to the wall between them. Laura hated herself for keeping score, but she couldn't help it. Every time Jack turned away, it felt like another confirmation that she was invisible. She tried to fill the void with her students. Teaching had always been her passion, and the kids adored her. Mrs. Callahan was the cool teacher, the one who understood their struggles and made Shakespeare seem almost fun. Her classroom was filled with laughter and lively debate, a stark contrast to the growing tension at home. But the applause of her students wasn't enough to drown out the quiet ache that settled in her chest when she returned to their empty house. She longed for Jack's touch, for the simple reassurance of his hand on hers, but he was always too tired, too preoccupied. One night, after another solitary dinner, Laura reached for her phone and called her best friend, Amy. "You okay, babe?" Amy asked, her voice warm but concerned. "I don't know," Laura admitted, curling up on the couch with a glass of wine. "I just feel forgotten." "Jack's working late again?" "Always," Laura sighed. "I know it's his job, but sometimes it feels like I'm not even here, like I'm just part of the furniture." "You've got to talk to him," Amy said firmly. "Tell him how you feel." Laura shook her head even though Amy couldn't see her. "He's so stressed already. I don't want to add to it. And what if he thinks I'm being selfish?" Amy hesitated. "It's not selfish to want attention from your husband, Laura. You deserve to feel seen. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Laura didn't feel seen. Jack looked through her, past her, like she was a ghost haunting the edges of his life. And so, Laura started finding ways to distract herself. At first, it was harmless. Staying late at school to organize lesson plans, joining a book club with the neighbors. But soon, she began lingering in places where she could feel noticed. The grocery store clerk who complimented her outfit, the friendly smile of the barista at her favorite coffee shop, small moments of acknowledgement that made her feel alive again. She never told Jack about these interactions. They weren't important, she told herself. But deep down, she knew they were filling a gap he had left behind. George sat on the edge of the hospital bed, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to the air around him. The doctor's words echoed in his mind like a judge's gavel slamming down. Stage 1 lung cancer. The prognosis is hopeful, but we need to act quickly. He clenched his fists, staring at the floor tiles as if their symmetry could somehow steady him. For years, George had prided himself on being unshakable, a man who didn't flinch at pain, who met life's challenges head-on. Yet, the word cancer had an icy finality to it that pierced even his iron exterior. "Mr. Morgan?" the doctor prompted, breaking the silence. "Yeah," George said gruffly, his voice rougher than usual. "I heard you the first time." On the drive home, George gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. He hated hospitals, hated the vulnerability they forced upon him. Vulnerability was for weak men, and George had vowed long ago never to be weak. Not after his wife's death, when he'd found himself a single father to a grieving boy. He'd taken the grief and buried it beneath a mountain of work, whiskey, and discipline. The thought of Jack stirred a complex knot of emotions in his chest. Pride, guilt, and something darker he couldn't quite name. He'd been hard on the boy, he knew that. Too hard, maybe. But life wasn't easy, and George believed it was better to toughen Jack up than let him crumble under pressure. When Jack showed up at George's small apartment a week later, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of duty and concern. George watched as his son stood in the doorway, holding a bag of groceries in one hand and a medical folder in the other. "You should have told me sooner," Jack said, stepping inside uninvited. George shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't see the point. Nothing you can do about it." Jack dropped the groceries on the counter with more force than necessary. "That's bullshit, and you know it. You're moving in with me and Laura. We'll keep an eye on you, make sure you're following through with treatment." "Moving in?" George snorted, but his voice lacked its usual bite. "I don't need a damn babysitter." "It's not up for discussion," Jack replied, his tone clipped. "I'm not leaving you here to waste away alone." George opened his mouth to argue, but something in Jack's eyes stopped him. It wasn't just determination, it was care, a stubborn kind of love George didn't think he deserved. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. 2 weeks later, George arrived at Jack's house with a single suitcase. The place was bigger than he expected, with a tidy lawn and a cozy porch. Laura greeted him at the door with a practiced smile, but George noticed the faint tension in her shoulders. "George," she said warmly, stepping aside to let him in. "We've set up the guest room for you. I hope you'll be comfortable." "Thanks," George muttered, avoiding her gaze. He didn't like feeling like a guest in his son's home, but he knew better than to say so. He followed Laura through the house, his boots scuffing against the hardwood floors. The guest room was modest but clean, a neatly made bed, a small dresser, and a window that overlooked the backyard. George set his suitcase down and looked around, his chest tightening. It was too quiet, too sterile. Nothing like the chaotic warmth of the home he'd shared with his late wife and Jack years ago. "You'll let me know if you need anything," Laura said, lingering in the doorway. "I'll be fine," George replied curtly, already turning his back to her. The first few days were awkward. George spent most of his time in his room, emerging only for meals or doctor's appointments. Laura tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his hobbies or his time in the service, but he answered in monosyllables, uncomfortable with her polite curiosity. One morning, over coffee, Jack finally addressed the tension. "Look, Dad," he began, setting his mug down. "I know this isn't easy for you. It's not easy for us either, but we're family. We'll get through it." George grunted. Family. Funny word for people I barely see anymore. Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "You're here now. Let's try to make the most of it." George didn't respond, but later that afternoon, he wandered into the living room while Laura was watching a cooking show. She looked up, surprised, as he sat down on the opposite end of the couch. "Anything good?" he asked, nodding at the screen. "It's just a rerun," Laura said, smiling cautiously. George nodded, staring at the TV, but not really watching. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a tentative sense of belonging. But it was fragile, and deep down, he feared it wouldn't last. The change was subtle at first. Laura began lingering in the kitchen after dinner, ostensibly to clean up. But more often than not, George was there too, nursing his second cup of coffee. Jack would hear the low hum of their voices from the living room, punctuated by Laura's soft laughter. He told himself it was nothing, just Laura being kind as she always was, but something about it gnawed at him. One evening, Jack walked into the kitchen to find Laura perched on a bar stool, leaning forward with her chin resting on her hand. George was mid-story, gesturing with his hands as he described a mishap at his old carpentry job. "And then the damn beam came crashing down right in front of me," George said, his voice animated in a way Jack hadn't seen in years. Laura laughed, her eyes sparkling. "That must have been terrifying." "Nah," George replied, grinning. "Just another day on the job." Jack cleared his throat, and both of them looked up. Laura straightened, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Hey," Jack said, keeping his tone casual. "What's going on?" "Just listening to your dad's stories," Laura said quickly, hopping off the stool. "You're lucky to have such a storyteller in the family." "Yeah, lucky," Jack muttered, his gaze lingering on George, who suddenly seemed very interested in his coffee cup. The next morning, Jack found Laura standing at the counter, flipping through the morning mail. She was dressed in a silk robe that barely grazed her thighs, her hair still damp from the shower. George shuffled in, his slippers scuffing against the floor. He froze briefly when he saw her, then looked away, muttering a gruff, "Morning." Jack entered the kitchen moments later, immediately noticing the tension in the air. His eyes flicked to Laura's attire, then to George's averted gaze. "Laura," Jack said, his tone sharp. "Don't you think you should, put something on?" Laura glanced down at herself, feigning surprise. "Oh, come on, Jack. It's just a robe. Your dad doesn't care, do you, George?" George coughed, avoiding her eyes. "Doesn't bother me." "Well, it bothers me," Jack snapped. "We're not alone here, Laura." Laura rolled her eyes but gave a small, apologetic smile. "Fine. I'll change." As she walked past Jack, he noticed a faint smirk tugging at the corners of her lips, a look he couldn't quite decipher. That afternoon, Jack came home early from a canceled shift and found the house unusually quiet. His shoes echoed on the hardwood as he stepped into the living room. The curtains were drawn, casting the space in muted light, and there, sitting across from each other, were Laura and George. Laura was draped across the couch in a short lounge dress, her legs crossed, one bare foot dangling lazily. George sat in the armchair, leaning slightly forward, his expression oddly intense as Laura spoke in low, measured tones. Jack's voice broke the quiet. "What's going on in here?" Laura glanced up, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Oh, hey, just chatting with your dad. He was telling me about his old fishing trips." George shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Nothing much, just killing time." Jack's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. Maybe you could kill time with a little more space between you, he said, his voice laced with irritation. Laura laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on Jack's nerves. Jack, don't be so dramatic. Dramatic? Jack shot back, crossing his arms. Laura, I've asked you to dress appropriately around him. And Dad, you're not exactly helping by sitting here like you're on a date. George raised his hands defensively. Hey, I'm not doing anything wrong. Laura stood up, brushing past Jack with a breezy air. Fine, I'll go change, but you're really making a mountain out of a molehill. Jack watched her disappear down the hallway, his frustration mounting. He turned to George, who avoided his gaze. You need to set some boundaries, Jack said tightly. George nodded but said nothing, and the tension in the room lingered long after Laura returned, now wearing jeans and a sweater that seemed more like armor than comfort. In the days that followed, Laura's behavior only grew more perplexing. She started volunteering to run errands for George, picking up his prescriptions or making him special meals. Jack noticed how she'd laugh a little too loudly at his jokes, her touch lingering just a second too long when she handed him a cup of tea. When Jack brought it up, she dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. I'm just trying to be nice, Jack. He's your father and he's sick. What's the harm in that? Jack wanted to believe her, but the unease coiled tighter in his chest with every passing day. Something felt off, and no matter how much he tried to push it aside, the nagging suspicion refused to leave. George sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his hands, watching Laura move around the room. She had just finished preparing breakfast for Jack before he left for his shift, but now she was tidying up, humming softly to herself. Her movements were graceful, effortless, and George found it difficult to look away. It started innocently enough. He'd always appreciated her kindness, the way she greeted him every morning with a warm smile and a cheerful, "Good morning, George," that felt genuine. She treated him like he mattered, not like an old man who was simply taking up space. But over time, those small gestures began to mean more to him than they should. Want a refill? Laura asked, holding the coffee pot aloft. George nodded, holding out his mug. Sure, thanks. As she leaned over to pour, George caught a whiff of her perfume, a light floral scent that lingered just long enough to stir something in him. He glanced away quickly, ashamed at the flicker of warmth in his chest. She wasn't doing anything wrong, he reminded himself. She was just being nice. The turning point came one quiet afternoon. Laura had spent the morning running errands, and George found himself glancing at the clock more often than usual. The house felt strangely empty without her bustling about. When she finally returned, her arms laden with grocery bags, George got up from his usual spot on the couch to help her. You didn't have to go out of your way for me, he said, taking a bag from her hands. It's no trouble, she replied with a laugh. You've got to eat, don't you? As they unpacked the groceries together, George noticed how her fingers brushed his when she handed him a carton of eggs. It was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. He glanced at her, but she was already turning away, oblivious. Or was she? That evening, George lingered at the kitchen table long after dinner was done. Laura was tidying up as usual, her robe loosely tied at the waist. He knew he should look away, but his eyes betrayed him, following the gentle sway of the fabric as she moved. She paused to adjust the neckline of her robe, and before he could stop himself, the words tumbled out. You remind me of my wife, he said, his voice low. Laura froze, then turned to face him, a curious smile playing on her lips. Do I? George nodded, his grip tightening around his coffee cup. She was like you, always so thoughtful, so kind. She made this house feel alive. You're like that. Laura blushed faintly, a warm pink rising to her cheeks. That's sweet of you to say, George, but I think you're giving me too much credit. He shook his head. Number, you deserve it. Even with everything you've got going on, taking care of Jack, managing the house, dealing with me, you still managed to make it all look easy. Her smile softened. You deserve more, George. Even with your illness, you've stayed so strong. I admire that about you. George felt his throat tighten. It had been years, decades even, since anyone had spoken to him like that. He swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. In the days that followed, George found himself seeking out Laura's presence. He would linger in the kitchen while she cooked, offering to chop vegetables or wash dishes, just to have an excuse to stay close. He'd listen intently as she talked about her students or a book she was reading, nodding along even when he didn't fully understand. And then there were the moments when he caught himself staring. Like the time Laura bent down to retrieve a pan from the lower cabinet, her robe slipping slightly off her shoulder. George's eyes lingered too long, and when she straightened up and caught his gaze, he quickly looked away, his face burning. "Everything okay?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Yeah," he mumbled, taking a long sip of his coffee to hide his discomfort. But later that night, as he lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, the image of her lingered in his mind. He told himself it was wrong, that he needed to stop these thoughts before they spiraled out of control. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't deny the way Laura made him feel, seen, valued, alive. One morning, as Laura was setting the table for breakfast, George hesitated before speaking. "You know, Laura," he began, his voice hesitant, "I don't think I ever thanked you properly for everything you've done for me. For letting me stay here, for putting up with an old man like me." She looked up from the plate she was arranging, her expression softening. "You don't need to thank me, George. Your family." He smiled faintly, though the word family stung more than it soothed. Family didn't look at each other the way he sometimes caught himself looking at her. And family certainly didn't make him feel the way she did. The day had been mercifully quiet for Jack, a rarity in his line of work. No heart-stopping emergencies, no frantic sprints to save lives, just a steady stream of manageable cases that allowed him to clock out earlier than expected. He glanced at his watch as he pulled into the driveway. It was barely 4:30 p.m., much earlier than usual. Jack killed the engine and stepped out of the car, stretching his tired muscles. The house stood in front of him, its windows glowing faintly in the late afternoon light. Yet, as he approached the door, a strange unease settled over him. The usual sounds of home, the hum of the TV, the clatter of dishes, Laura's soft humming, were absent. Frowning, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick and still, carrying none of the warmth he'd expected. "Laura?" he called, his voice echoing faintly. "Dad?" Silence. Jack dropped his bag by the door, his brow furrowing as he walked further into the house. The living room was neat, but his trained eye caught the details that didn't fit. 2 wine glasses sat on the coffee table, one tipped slightly, a small puddle of dark red liquid pooling beneath it. A bottle of Merlot rested nearby, half empty. "Laura?" he called again, louder this time. No answer. A faint sound caught his attention, a muffled rustling, almost imperceptible. Jack froze, his senses sharpening. The noise was coming from down the hall near the storage closet. His heart began to pound, an instinctive response he couldn't suppress. He moved quickly but quietly, his footsteps barely audible against the hardwood floor. As he approached the closet, the sounds grew clearer. Whispers, interspersed with the unmistakable creak of movement. His breath hitched as a chill ran down his spine. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, his hand reaching for the doorknob. He turned it slowly, pushing the door open in one swift motion. The sight that met his eyes knocked the air from his lungs. There they were, Laura, his wife, and George, his father, tangled together in a scene so grotesque it felt like a punch to the gut. Their movements froze as the door swung wide, their eyes snapping to Jack in unison. For a moment, time seemed to stretch unbearably, the room filled only with the sound of Jack's ragged breathing. "Jack!" Laura started, her voice trembling. But Jack didn't let her finish. His voice erupted, raw and shaking with fury. "What the FCK are you doing?" George scrambled backward, his face a mask of horror and shame, while Laura tried to cover herself, her hands trembling as she reached for the edges of her robe. "Jack, this isn't," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other uselessly. Jack took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't you dare try to explain this to me," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his anger. "In my house? With my father?" George finally found his voice, though it was weak and barely audible. "Son, listen to me." "No!" Jack bellowed, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to say a goddamn word." The air between them was electric, charged with betrayal and disbelief. Jack's mind raced, trying to process the scene before him, but nothing made sense. The two people he trusted most had shattered his world in a single, unforgivable moment. Laura, tears streaming down her face, reached out to him. "Jack, please let me explain." He recoiled as if her touch burned him. "Explain?" he spat. "What could you possibly say to make this okay?" She fell silent, her shoulders shaking with sobs. George sat slumped against the wall, his face buried in his hands. Jack turned away, his chest heaving. The sight of them, the smell of wine and sweat, was suffocating. He stormed out of the closet, his mind a whirlwind of rage and devastation. Jack's hands were shaking, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he paced back and forth in the hallway just outside the closet. The image of Laura and George, his wife and his father, was burned into his mind, an unbearable loop he couldn't escape. From behind him, he heard the frantic shuffling of clothes and muffled sobs. "Jack!" Laura's voice, desperate and trembling, broke through the chaos. He spun around, his eyes blazing with fury. "Don't even start, Laura. Don't you fucking dare!" Laura was a mess, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with tears. She clutched the robe around her body as if it could shield her from the storm brewing in Jack's eyes. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I can explain." "Explain!" Jack roared, his voice echoing through the house. "Explain what, exactly? That I just walked in on my wife screwing my father? What part of that needs explaining?" George, still crouched in the corner of the closet, finally stood, his movements slow and heavy. He avoided Jack's eyes as he pulled his shirt over his head. "Son," he began, his voice low and hoarse. It's not what it looks like." Jack turned on him, his anger flaring even hotter. "Not what it looks like? Really?" He took a step closer, his fists clenched. "So, you're telling me you weren't just on top of my wife? That I didn't just see exactly what the fuck you've been doing behind my back?" George raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Jack, calm down." "Don't you fucking tell me to calm down!" Jack's voice cracked, his composure teetering on the edge. "You—" He jabbed a finger in George's direction. "You were supposed to be my father. You were supposed to be someone I could trust." "Jack!" Laura's voice wavered as she stepped toward him, reaching out with trembling hands. He recoiled, his expression one of pure disgust. "Don't touch me," he snapped. "You've got no right." Laura's sobs grew louder, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Jack's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Go this far? So what, Laura? There was a plan?" "No," she cried, shaking her head vehemently. I was trying to help him." Jack's jaw dropped, his disbelief giving way to incredulous fury. "Help him!" he shouted. "By screwing him in my house, in my closet? That's your idea of help?" George, his face pale and drawn, finally met Jack's gaze. "Jack, listen!" "No, you listen!" Jack roared, cutting him off. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed everything! Everything I've worked for! Everything I've built!" "Jack," George said, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "I wasn't thinking clearly." "No, you weren't thinking at all," Jack thundered. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his whole body trembling with rage. "You took advantage of her. You used her—" "That's not true," Laura interjected, her voice shrill with desperation. "It wasn't like that, Jack. I wanted to—" "Shut up!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking. "Just shut up, Laura! I don't want to hear it!" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Laura's muffled sobs. Jack turned away from them, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady himself. But the rage, the betrayal, the sheer absurdity of the situation, it was too much. "You know what?" he said finally, his voice cold and hard. "I don't even care anymore. Both of you, get out. I don't want to see either of you." "Jack, please," Laura begged, stepping closer. "We can fix this." "Fix this?" Jack whirled around, his eyes blazing. "You think there's a way to fix this? You think I'll just forget what I saw? What you did?" He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and devoid of humor. "No, Laura, this is beyond fixing." George took a tentative step forward, his voice low and shaky. "I'll leave," he said quietly. "But Jack, I'm sorry. I really am." Jack's expression darkened, his lips curling into a sneer. "Sorry? You're sorry? That's all you've got?" George bowed his head, unable to meet his son's gaze. "Just get out," Jack said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with barely suppressed emotion. "Both of you, out of my sight." He turned his back on them, his shoulders heaving as he fought to keep his composure. Behind him, he heard the faint shuffle of footsteps as they moved toward the door, their presence a heavy weight that finally began to lift as they disappeared from view. But the damage was done, and Jack was left standing in the wreckage of the life he thought he knew. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed down on the chest like a weight. Jack stood motionless, his fists still clenched at his sides, his breathing labored as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The tension was unbearable, broken only by Laura's choked sobs. "Jack," Laura began, her voice trembling. She wiped her tear-streaked face with trembling hands, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please, you have to understand. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for this to happen?" Jack's voice was low, dangerously calm. He turned to face her, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. "You didn't mean for this to happen? Then what the hell were you doing?" Laura flinched but pushed forward, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I was just trying to help him, Jack. He's your father. He's dying and he's so lonely. I thought I could give him something to hold on to, something to make him feel better." "Make him feel better?" Jack repeated, his voice rising. His hands flew to his head as he spun away from her, pacing in agitation. "You thought that was the way to help him? By betraying me? By destroying our marriage?" Tears streamed down Laura's face as she shook her head vehemently. "I didn't think it would go this far, I swear. I just wanted to ease his pain, Jack. He's been through so much and—" "Stop!" Jack bellowed, turning back to her. "Just stop! Do you even hear yourself right now? You're justifying the unjustifiable." Laura's sobs grew louder, her words coming in broken fragments. "He needed someone. I didn't know what else to do. You're never home, and he's always here, and—" Jack's laughter was bitter, sharp, cutting through her excuses like a blade. "Oh, so now this is my fault? Is that it? Because I work my ass off to provide for us, because I'm not here to babysit my wife and my father. You decided to—" He broke off, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. George, who had been standing silently in the corner, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Son, it wasn't her fault. Don't put this all on her. Jack's head snapped toward him, his eyes blazing. Oh, don't you dare, he hissed. Don't you dare try to protect her. You're just as guilty, if not worse. George sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, Jack noticed how old and frail his father looked, how the illness had hollowed him out. I'm weak, George admitted, his voice breaking. I've always been weak. I shouldn't have let it happen, but I couldn't stop myself. Couldn't stop yourself? Jack's voice was icy, his words laced with venom. You're blaming this on your weakness? Are you even listening to yourself? You're pathetic. George flinched but didn't argue. I don't expect you to forgive me, Jack. I wasn't thinking straight. Knowing I don't have much time left, it does something to you. It makes you desperate. Jack's laugh was bitter, cold. Desperate? You've always been desperate, Dad. Desperate to control everything, desperate to take what you want, no matter the cost. And now you've taken this. You've taken her. Laura stepped forward again, her hands outstretched as if to plead with him. Jack, please. I love you. I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I could make things better for everyone. Better? Jack's voice broke, and he shook his head in disbelief. You thought sleeping with my father would make things better? He turned his back on her, his shoulders heaving as he tried to contain the storm inside him. Jack, George said quietly, his tone almost pleading. I know I've failed you in more ways than I can count, but I don't want this to be the way things end between us. Jack spun around, his face contorted with rage. This is how it ends, Dad. This is exactly how it ends. You've always been a selfish bastard, and now you've proven it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Laura dropped to her knees, her sobs racking her body as she clung to the edge of the couch. Jack, please. I can't lose you. Please don't do this. Jack stared at her, his expression a mask of pain and betrayal. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The weight of what they had done, of what they had destroyed, was too much to bear. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy, each one echoing like the closing of a coffin lid. Behind him, Laura's cries and George's defeated sighs followed him, but Jack didn't look back. He couldn't. The house felt empty, but not in the way Jack had hoped it would. Laura's things were gone now, her clothes, her books, the framed photos she had carefully arranged on the shelves. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the creak of a floorboard under Jack's pacing footsteps. Sign it, Jack said, sliding the divorce papers across the table. He refused to look at Laura, who sat opposite him, her face pale and drawn. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen, her eyes darting to him in a silent plea. Jack, can't we— No, he cut her off, his voice flat and emotionless. There's nothing left to say. You know that as well as I do. Laura swallowed hard, tears pooling in her eyes, but she said nothing more. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was the only thing that filled the room. When she finally pushed the documents back to him, Jack stood without a word and left the kitchen. Word of the scandal spread faster than Jack could have anticipated. Laura had barely finished moving into a friend's spare room when the whispers began. A colleague from the school must have overheard something, and soon the story was everywhere. You slept with his father? One of her co-workers hissed in disbelief during a faculty meeting. It's not true, Laura protested weakly, but her face betrayed her. The principal called her into his office the next day, his expression heavy with disapproval. Laura, he said, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the desk, I think it's best if you resign. The parents, they're already talking. This kind of attention isn't good for the school. Laura nodded numbly. She knew it was useless to argue. The whispers had turned to outright laughter, her colleagues snickering behind her back, and parents glaring at her during school events. Packing up her desk was the hardest part. The classroom she had once filled with life and laughter felt alien now, the walls closing in on her as she placed her personal items into a cardboard box. A group of students passed by the open door, their murmured giggles like knives against her skin. George, meanwhile, retreated into himself. The man who had once been so confident and unyielding now shuffled through Jack's house like a shadow of his former self. He barely spoke, his meals untouched more often than not. One morning Jack found him sitting on the back porch, staring out at the overgrown garden. His shoulders were slumped, his face lined with regret. "Dad," Jack said, his voice taut, "I think it's time you moved out." George didn't look at him. "Yeah," he murmured. "I figured as much." Jack felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly smothered by the anger that still burned in his chest. "I'll help you find a place," he said curtly, before turning and walking back inside. George left a week later, moving into a small apartment on the other side of town. Jack didn't check in on him, didn't answer the few tentative calls George made in the weeks that followed. He thought cutting him off would feel like freedom, but instead, it left a hollow ache that refused to fade. 2 months later, Jack got the call he had been expecting, but dreading. George had passed away in his sleep, the cancer finally claiming what was left of him. The funeral was a modest affair, organized entirely by Jack. He handled the arrangements with clinical efficiency, choosing a simple casket, a small plot, and a brief service. He did it not out of love, but out of duty, a final act of respect for a man who had taken so much from him. When the day of the funeral arrived, Jack didn't attend. Instead, he stayed home, sitting in the quiet living room with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He stared at the empty space where Laura's favorite armchair used to be, the silence around him as deafening as the chaos in his mind. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in shadows. Jack closed his eyes, exhaling a long, shaky breath. The echoes of the past still lingered, but he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the cafe was warm and tinged with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Jack sat at a corner table, absent-mindedly stirring a spoon through his black coffee. The last year had been a blur of rebuilding, selling the house, moving to a quieter part of town, throwing himself into work. But today was different. Today, he had promised himself to step outside his carefully constructed walls, even if only for an hour. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Jack looked up, startled, to see a woman standing beside his table. She was holding a cup of tea, her red hair loosely tied back and her smile easy but not intrusive. No," he said quickly, motioning to the empty chair. "Thanks," she said, settling into the seat across from him. "It's surprisingly busy for a Monday afternoon." Jack nodded, unsure what to say. He hadn't come here for company, but something about her presence was disarming. She wasn't overly polished or trying too hard, just normal. "I'm Kate, by the way," she said, extending a hand across the table. "Jack," he replied, shaking her hand briefly. Her grip was firm but warm, her smile unwavering. Over the next hour, their conversation flowed in a way Jack hadn't experienced in a long time. Kate was a social worker who had recently moved to town to take a position at a local shelter. She spoke passionately about her work, her laughter lighting up the dim cafe as she recounted stories about her colleagues and the chaos of settling into a new city. Jack found himself smiling more than he had in months. There was no pretense with Kate, no sense of her trying to impress him or dig too deeply into his life. She seemed content to exist in the moment, and for once, Jack allowed himself to do the same. "Do you come here often?" Kate asked, leaning back in her chair as she sipped her tea. "Not really," Jack admitted. "I guess I was just looking for a change of scenery." "Well, good choice," she said with a grin. This place has great tea, and decent company, apparently. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. You don't even know me. Not yet, Kate said, her tone light but sincere. Over the next few weeks, Jack and Kate began to see each other more often. At first, it was casual, a shared coffee here, a walk through the park there. Kate had a way of making even the simplest moments feel significant. One Saturday, she invited him to volunteer at the shelter's food drive. Jack hesitated at first, but Kate's enthusiasm was infectious. It's just a few hours, she coaxed, her eyes sparkling with mischief. And you'll get free donuts. How can you say no to that? Jack sighed dramatically. Fine, but if the donuts are stale, I'm blaming you. The food drive was chaotic, but rewarding. Jack found himself laughing as he loaded bags of groceries into cars, Kate at his side, cracking jokes and rallying the volunteers. It was the first time in months that Jack felt genuinely useful outside of work, and he couldn't help but be drawn to Kate's energy. One evening, as they walked along the river, Kate stopped abruptly and turned to him. You know, she said, her voice quieter now, I'm glad we met. Jack looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. Yeah, he said after a moment. Me too. They stood there for a while, the sounds of the water lapping against the shore filling the silence. Jack felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. The balcony overlooked a quiet stretch of the city where the rooftops sloped gently toward the horizon. The evening sky was awash with colors, deep oranges fading into soft purples, streaks of pink like brushstrokes on a canvas. Jack leaned against the railing, his fingers loosely wrapped around a glass of iced tea. Beside him, Kate rested her elbows on the edge, her hair catching the golden light of the setting sun. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content to let the stillness settle around them. The sounds of the world below, faint laughter from a neighbor's patio, the distant hum of traffic, felt muted as if the city itself had slowed to watch the day's end. This view, Kate said softly, her voice breaking the silence. It's worth every box I had to unpack to get here. Jack chuckled, glancing at her. You did most of the unpacking. I just carried the heavy stuff. She turned to him, a playful smile tugging at her lips. You carried one heavy box and complained the whole time. Don't act like a hero. He smirked, shaking his head. It was a very heavy box. Kate laughed, the sound light and unrestrained. It was a laugh Jack had come to love, a laugh that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. He studied her for a moment, the way her face lit up in the fading light, the way her eyes sparkled with unspoken warmth. What? She asked, catching his gaze. Nothing, he said, smiling softly. Just thinking. She raised an eyebrow. About? Jack hesitated, then looked out at the horizon. How different everything feels now. A year ago. He trailed off, the words hanging in the air. Kate placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. You don't have to say it, she said. I get it. He turned to her, his expression serious but calm. It's not that I don't want to talk about it. It's just, for the first time in a long time, it feels like I'm not stuck there anymore, like I'm not looking over my shoulder. Kate nodded, her thumb brushing against his sleeve. That's a good feeling, isn't it? Jack exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as he leaned into the railing. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the balcony. Kate pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as a cool breeze swept through. You cold? Jack asked, already shrugging off his jacket. No, I'm fine, she said, but he draped it over her shoulders anyway. Thanks, she murmured, pulling it snugly around her. He nodded, his gaze returning to the sky. The last sliver of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, leaving behind a deep, quiet blue. You know, Kate said after a moment, her tone thoughtful, I think sunsets like this are why I moved here. There's something about them that makes you feel, I don't know, connected. Like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Jack looked at her, her words resonating in a way he hadn't expected. He thought about all the steps that had led him to this moment, the heartbreak, the anger, the nights he spent wondering if he'd ever feel whole again. You're right, he said finally. It does feel like that. Kate turned to him, her eyes searching his. I'm glad you feel that way, she said softly. Jack smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Me too. They stood there a while longer, the world around them fading into quiet darkness. Jack felt a peace he hadn't known in years, a calm that came not from forgetting the past, but from finally accepting it. The sound of wind chimes tinkling in the distance broke the stillness, and Kate chuckled. Looks like someone beat us to the romantic soundtrack. Jack laughed, his hand brushing hers on the railing. For a moment, he hesitated, then let his fingers intertwine with hers. Kate didn't pull away. Instead, she gave his hand a small squeeze, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Jack looked at her, his chest tightening, not with pain but with something new, something hopeful. And for the first time, he let himself hold on to it.